Okay, guys, what is going on? Hope everyone's enjoying the emerging spring weather. Um, let's jump right in. So, last week we went over the major areas of concern. So, North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, East, Southeast, and South Asia, Oceania, the Middle East, Antarctica, and space. I know that's the whole world plus space, but the main thing was the major issues in every region. So, within North America, we have maintaining good trade relations. South America as an emerging power, stability within Africa, old relationships in Europe, basically all of Asia's emerging relationships, strategic importance of Oceania, instability in the Middle East, and sort of the emerging new world that comes with Antarctica and space as more capabilities increase. Now, for memorizing the key rival states, if you want to impress people without looking at your notes and just list this off, you can just think about the sentence, I read cool news very carefully. So that would be Iran, Russia, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, and China. So I read cool news very carefully. Um, so the plan for this week, changing from the syllabus once more, today's public opinion. None of this is on the midterm, in case you've already taken the midterm. And then Thursday, you have that off to finish up any work you have on the midterm. So no slides or anything will be posted. So public opinion, let's jump into that. Well, that's just the aggregate set of views held by a significant portion of the population. How people feel about stuff. Hopefully the public opinion for this class is very high. Hopefully. Anyway, it's a bellwether for the popularity of a president, a policy, or basically anything. Normally, within foreign policy, it is the policy itself or the president's response or creation of that policy. That's what we're going to be talking about almost entirely today is president and policy. Um, One of the more funny things that people started to notice back in the early 2010s was things that are actually more popular than Congress. So cockroaches, Genghis Khan, lice have absolutely dominated. And then you have to look at stuff that's like, how is that less popular than Congress? John Edwards makes sense. If you don't know who John Edwards is and um, why he fell out of you guessed it, 2008 election, you can look that up on your own time. And of course, with public opinion, it's mostly stats, and there's all sorts of different ways to look at stats. So the one on the left is just an overall holistic view of how people feel about presidents. On the right, I would say this is a bit more scientific, but the approval rating of presidents during their policies or their presidencies. If you notice, it almost always starts strong and then goes down. I think the only major one that goes up during the presidency is Clinton. Just everybody seemed to like Clinton more as that first presidency, or as his presidency went on. And what an interesting time to start talking about public opinion. I didn't plan it like this, but over the weekend, I'm sure we all heard uh, Operation Epic Fury bombed a bunch of places in Iran, killing the Ayatollah. And especially for older people who remember the war in Iraq and stuff like that, it seems very familiar. The difference, I think, is that unlike Iraq, this is already starting off pretty unpopular. And as we've seen with wars, and we're about to see later, that it normally starts off quite popular and then goes down in popularity as the war drags out. So for public opinion, we'll be looking mainly at causal sensitivity, which sounds way more technical than it needs to be. rally around the flag, elite cues in the two-level game, or how popularity can be used in selling different policies. By the two-level, we're talking about the domestic and international. So um, we'll get to it. So causal sensitivity mainly has to do with how context matters. Um, Great example being why the bombing of Iran is far less popular than the invasion of Iraq, or a hypothetical invasion of Iran would be less popular than 2003 Iraq. Mainly the sense that we weren't coming off the war on terror when the war on terror began. So it's a lot of more of the same. And that's why so many people, especially those who remember the war on terror, are not very fond of the idea of US troops possibly being deployed to Iran. And success or failure matters. We'll get into that. So, a lot of people think that the Vietnam War became very unpopular because of the draft. And I'm not saying the draft didn't play a role. I'm not saying the draft was popular. But what I am saying is that the draft was not until 1969. But if you can look here, the war didn't become more that red didn't go to the top. More people saying that sending troops to Vietnam was a mistake than not actually was before the draft, and it was because of something called the Tet Offensive. So here we have, I think, an image more people are familiar with the Vietnam War. A guy burning his draft card, refusing to participate. A lot of people, when they were drafted, decided to move to Canada or just outside of the United States. They wouldn't have to participate. So wildly unpopular. It's a big reason why the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18 following the Vietnam War. But uh, military defeat had more to do with it. So you're probably thinking, Paul, you super interesting voiced person. What does the Tet Offensive have to do with the Vietnam War? Well, Tet is basically in Vietnam and most of Southeast Asia, I believe, a version of the Lunar New Year. So, like in my household, we celebrate Chinese New Year, almost as always the same as Tet. So, uh, might not be the biggest thing in the West. We would probably equate it, I think, from the gut with our New Year. So it's like, oh, okay, so Tet is you watch a big ball drop or drink champagne or whatever. Not the case. It's more like Christmas. You go back to your family. In most places, you get like at least a week off of work, eat traditional foods, all this stuff. So it's a very big deal. Now, during the 68 in the Vietnam War, everyone on the American side had assumed that the fighting would die down during Tet. Soldiers would want to go back home, spend time with their families before continuing the war. And it's honestly not the worst gut instinct. World War One, famously, both sides would come out of the trenches and play soccer on Christmas. So what the Americans were expecting was more or less of a timeout. So the Americans, assuming the Vietnamese would take a timeout, well, the Americans decided to take a timeout too, and have less people on guard posts and stuff like that, which left all the borders very unprepared. So over 100 locations were attacked all at the same time during Tet. Of course, the Vietnamese soldiers did not go back home, and there was a major loss of territory. And this isn't just a defeat somewhere, like Operation Market Garden in World War II. It's a defeat everywhere, basically. And even then, there was a counteroffensive um, to gain all the territory that was lost. And you would think, oh, okay, well, there's a counteroffensive. We'll call it a draw. No, because of the fact that the counteroffensive was very, very deadly. So tons of people were lost on Tet, tons of territory was lost on Tet, and then all these resources and people were lost taking the territory back also. Hue City being a really big example of that. Urban warfare in Vietnam, very high casualties. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look way, way, way to 1995 and 2000 at the very end of this and see that after the trend that the Tet Offensive started, people's opinions on Vietnam haven't really changed to any significant degree. Um, in fact, they've only become more extreme. But what's also interesting or important to recognize is that it wasn't just the Tet Offensive. It was also the draft. It was also the fact that basically no politicians lost any children during the war. So it was an amalgamation of things, but Tet Offensive, or this big military defeat, is often credited with being the first domino to fall. Now, of course, I can't speak for everybody, at least until my machine is complete. But what everyone would call the credibility gap, I would think would be more memorable if people called it the competence gap. But the credibility gap is this idea that do people trust the government to do a good job? Are they credible when they say they're going to do what they do? Or what I would say is, are they competent? Um, if so, it doesn't seem like a waste of resources, so it's more sellable to the people. If Vietnam making it a democracy is cheap, and we can do it without losing a big battle like Tet, we can do it without a draft. It's more sellable to people. But if people knew the final price tag before going into it, they might not. And so if not, they see it as a waste of tax dollars and it becomes unpopular. More recent example, it's only a couple months old, is the what was called Liberation Day, or this big wave of tariffs on other states that the Trump administration was pushing. And they put out this big list of reciprocal tariffs of all these different places that the United States was going to start tariffing. There's a big map, but it sort of fell at the first hurdle or lost a lot of credibility, confidence, whatever you want to call it, when it was noticed that one of the places that was being tariffed was the Heard Island and McDonald Islands. Now, why does this stand out is because the main residents of these islands are penguins. So it became a meme that penguins are going to start having to pay what they owe. But the fact that this wasn't researched and not really well thought out, according to some people, really did sour a lot of the Liberation Day tariffs to a lot of people. Of course, this isn't unique just to Trump. There were a lot of issues with the Biden administration. By 2022, more people disapproved than approved of his performance. And there are multiple reasons for it. There's rarely ever just one reason. Of course, one of the bigger issues that eventually kept him from running for president a second time was his own health issues or prospective health issues with his mental cognition. Of course, it came out last May that he also has prostate cancer. But then there were also in this context dependent, right? People don't like to lose. And then there were unpopular policies that he did during his presidency. So the Afghanistan withdrawal was seen as sloppy, and a lot of people saw it as abandoning the people of Afghanistan after such a long time. And then Bidenomics, or with inflation being super high, still trying to convince people that the economy was still good. And in some ways it was, in some ways it wasn't. He just wasn't able to sell either of these. Now, we talk about these drop offs with unsuccessful wars, especially Vietnam, but for wars that are unmitigated, unqualified wins, like World War II, you can see that if you approved of the president at the beginning of the war, odds are you approved of him at the end also. So this is FDR's approval during World War II. We have stuff like the rally around the flag effect, when a leadership or a state become more powerful due to an external force. And that can be security issues, threats, and economics. We're going to go over examples of all three. Only one of them is in the United States, though. Now, when we think of rally around the flag effect in terms of security in the United States, you're probably thinking of a surprise attack on the United States that killed thousands and used airplanes. And we're, of course, talking about Pearl Harbor. Basically, everybody has that story of a grandfather or great grandfather, and it all plays out the same way. He was sitting at home, heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and left first thing to join the military. I couldn't find any photos online of people rushing to join the military. So here's my grandfather and his brothers. Probably the most famous example of this, and if you look at the Wikipedia page for Rally Around the Flag Effect, you'll see this too. September 11th and George Bush's approval. The difference of his, because for those who don't know, George Bush barely won the election in 2000. Some would say that he didn't. We're not going to go into the whole Florida controversy, but he was already starting off on shaky ground in 2001. But the difference in his approval between September 10th and September 12th was night and day. And of course, as we've talked about, that leads to the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And with unsuccessful wars or less than successful wars, we have this inversion in public opinion. We can also see it in other countries for political reasons, like we talked about the Canadian politician who was supposed to be coming into the next PM role. He was the heir apparent, Pierre Poilievre. Trump began making Canada being the 51st state jokes, of course, leading to Mark Carney, who's more left-leaning, being prime minister. And with economic stuff, especially in East Asia a lot, for reasons we don't have time to go into, but they'll suspend and start trading. It'll be very popular among China to boycott different products. When I was there, for example, there was like a switch. A bunch of people just stopped buying South Korean-made products. And we saw something similar with the Ukraine situation, where as soon as Ukraine was invaded by Russia, just Russian products weren't sold at stores as frequently anymore. I remember there was a big deal about Tito's handmade vodka having a big boom because a lot of liquor stores refused to sell Russian-made vodka, and Tito's is made in Austin. That's why the Bush approval rating is so interesting, because with September 11th, we have a rally around the flag, and with Iraq and the capture of Saddam Hussein, we have this whole competency issue of it's going to be very popular when we get a win, but then as soon as the win goes away, the popularity either goes down to where it was or goes down further. And it really comes to light with the news coverage around it too. Rolling into Iraq, you have the shock and awe, or the overwhelming United States victory within Iraq, and tearing down all the statues, people welcoming U.S. soldiers as liberators, and stuff like that. Any casualties, any deaths of American soldiers are still seen as tragic, but it's contextualized within more necessary for victory. We talked about the whole America F yeah thing, but that's sort of the overwhelming vibe during the beginning of the invasion. We talked about the Iraqi army falling apart like wet tissue paper, and the jokes like, how do you stop an Iraqi tank? And that's all well and good, but once the honeymoon is over, you might say. Especially with moments like mission accomplished, past tense, mission accomplished. That's a lot of the time when the popularity starts to fall. So elite cues, people might think of that as a who cares what the elites have to say. Chances are you already know how you feel about something, is I think what a lot of people think about with elite cues. Celebrity endorsements, like what Ryan Reynolds has to say about Taiwan, doesn't really affect my opinion on Taiwan. I don't even know if he has an opinion, it's just an example. But what elites decide not to talk about can also be important. Saudi Arabia killing a bunch of people in Yemen, not really discussed about because there's nothing to gain from it other than upsetting Saudi Arabia if you don't care about the people who are dying. So where do the elite cues come from? Well, the most elite of the elite, the president, party elites, media elites, interest groups, and celebrities and social media, which I guess if you use social media, that's where you fall into. I made a YouTube comment that got 9,000 likes, so I'm going to count myself in social media. So going back to the examples of Iraq and Vietnam, you have two presidents, Bush and Johnson, both from Texas, oddly enough. I just realized that, who are selling this idea of the war and ultimately become what we'd think of as like salesmen for it. Anytime it's a victory, you're going to fly down and have your big mission accomplished sign. And anytime there's a loss, so 18-year-old kids from the United States are getting sawed in half by machine guns, they're going to say, oh, well, they may have bloodied our nose, but we'll get back at them. So they sort of act as like hype men or salesmen for the war. I would honestly recommend looking up the text or the original recording of the speech, but this is the day that will live in infamy speech after Pearl Harbor. Um, and tell me that you don't want to, you can't feel the fire in his belly over this, since it's more well sold to the American people than Vietnam or Vietnam or Iraq War. As you can tell through here, politics are getting more polarizing. There's less of a middle ground, and it's more like team sports. So it can be harder for a president to sell a war because of that, or to have everybody so united after that. Especially when it's not rallying around the flag. And polarization's real. We're probably more polarized than ever. Um, so in terms of like what policies you're willing to accept from the president, just because he's a D or an R, um, does make war inherently less popular. I've seen even nowadays it's affecting the dating market, which I thought was interesting. But you're a lot less likely to date someone who has a different political opinion than you. It's probably good advice if you have such different values, but interesting at least. But I remember thinking in like 2018, 2017, with all these street protests and stuff going on, with how divided and polarized we are, it would be interesting for some sort of unifying act. What everyone always said was space aliens. We would all unite if space aliens came and could all hate the aliens together. But if something like were to come and unify everyone, maybe not space aliens, but I thought that at least people would be more unified if there's this big, massive event that brought everybody together. I wasn't wishing for it, but that's what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I guess I'm a silly goose because it just left people more divided than ever, really. And I was really hoping for a unifying movement. Maybe not at the beginning of COVID, let's all fight it together, but maybe once the vaccines were out and COVID's finally done, we could have something like a Victory Over Europe Day or Victory Over Japan Day, or we could call it a VC Day, Victory Over COVID. Um, but it never really had a definite end. It just sort of tapered off, and then everyone went from arguing about vaccines to arguing about Ukraine. So I'm still holding out for that unifying moment, though. Then next we have party elites, which sounds like a more fun than it is, I guess we would say. But if they're in the president's party, they normally defend him. If they're in the opposition party, they normally oppose him. Currently, the main party elites in opposition to Trump are Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi, who is retiring soon, and Chuck Schumer. Jeffries is the minority leader of the House, Schumer is the minority leader of the Senate, and Pelosi used to be Speaker of the House. But like I said, she's retiring and sort of moving out, so she's becoming more or less of a king or queen maker, which is a great segue into the influence the party elites have. Not only do they give a lot of support or opposition to the president, they kind of direct what the policy for the party is going to be. And they can do that by saying, as Democrats, we're going to focus on opposing Trump on, for example, immigration, or opposing Trump on Ukraine or whatever. But then they can also keep internal consistency within their own party to a degree that others can't. So while these are minority leaders and former minority leaders, they still can direct policy by having a say in who is going to be making up Congress. So a great example of that being the issue of Katie Porter versus Adam Schiff. Katie Porter and Adam Schiff, both congresspeople from California who wanted to go from the House to the Senate, which is seen as sort of a promotion. On the internet, Katie Porter was far more popular. Resistance Democrats all over the country, I would see Katie Porter stickers at their houses. She went kind of viral for being really good at interrogating people when they're brought to Congress for testimony. She'd have all these graphs and stuff. But she wouldn't always ride the party line, which is one thing people liked about her. Whereas Adam Schiff was a key player in the Russiagate scandal, conspiracy, hoax, whatever you want to call it. He, depending on how you feel about that situation, he was either the best or the worst. Some people think that because no evidence of collusion was found, Adam Schiff was ultimately seen as a stooge who lacks credibility. But he rode the party line. So both of them are running for Senate, and Pelosi, who is stepping down from her leadership role but still has this king or queen maker role, is determining who to support. Because keep in mind, Pelosi is super powerful and also from California. And so I think you can tell how this went, even without looking it up, who's the current senator for California. Take a second. Who do you think won because they got Pelosi's endorsement? Katie Porter, who doesn't ride party lines, or Adam Schiff, who does? Of course, it was Adam Schiff. So, yeah, party elites are going to make sure that the party is internally consistent as much as they can by making sure that there's not that much deviation within the party. AOC and Pelosi have had a very long relationship. Even though it's been a short amount of time, the amount of reconciliation, just to go into another fight, has been quite big. But for a fading leader and a rising leader among the Democrats, it is interesting to see how much deviation AOC is willing to do from the main party thing, because she was elected as a democratic socialist, not as a main neoliberal Democrat. So if she's going to be the leadership of the party, she has to balance maintaining the good graces of the party while also distinguishing herself enough to be a leader. Now, with media elites, there's two main types, but the main thing they have in common are platforms. So in this, we're just talking about news, really. But there's two ways to get platforms. One is traditional legacy media, already has a baked-in audience. People, especially older people, tend to watch traditional legacy media, so that's like cable news, radio, not podcast, but radio, and get their news that way. Whereas sort of the rising star is new media, and that's stuff like podcasts or YouTube videos, any sort of like online stuff. Mainly it's internet or not internet is the big difference. Now you talk about unifying figures for old media, or when people look at the environment now, they say, "Oh, I miss Walter Cronkite." I believe he was CBS News. I'm old, but I'm not that old. But he has a reputation, at least, for being someone that everybody trusted. But people say they want that, but they really don't. They want to listen to somebody that they already agree with. And so as we went from 4 channels on TV to 40 billion, people were able to find leaders among all that, or thought leaders will say among all that, that were able to capture large audiences. So on the left, that is Rush Limbaugh. He's a conservative radio host for a very, very long time. He passed away a few years ago. But with syndicated radio becoming more and more normal, and him able to get this big audience, it was a big deal. On the right, you have Bill Maher. So with the rise of stuff like premium cable, so stuff like HBO, you're able to have more transgressive, edgy stuff. Bill Maher is very, very left wing. And sooner or later, the main cable news stations are going to follow suit. Um, it's almost perfectly aligned here. MSNBC is literally on the far left. CNN is in this weird spot in the middle right now, and then Fox News on the right. CNN does tend to lean left, but they had a bunch of embarrassing stuff happen, especially losing a lot of credibility during COVID. And CNN Plus, which was their attempt at a streaming service that went very, very poorly. So CNN's kind of left in the middle right now. But I wasn't joking when I say people think they want fair and balanced coverage, but they actually don't. Um, or I won't say all people, but people on aggregate, the people and groups big enough to move advertisements tend to want that. Um, so yeah, there's this old meme. I believe I first ran into this when I was in undergrad. Obama was still president when I was an undergrad. I'm old. Um, but yeah, all these different coverages. But this whole BBC joke at the end is what I'm talking about with framing is the news says a lot when it chooses to ignore issues too. And now, of course, with the new media environment, you can find you're not stuck to one or like 4 channels with Cronkite. You're not stuck to just a few syndicated radio shows or a few cable news channels that are going to feed you the echo chamber that you want, but you're going to fall into these hyper specific groups. So when you think of like who makes up the new media left wing, you have Jennifer Welch, who appeals to a certain type, a very specific type of listener. On the right, you have Megyn Kelly, who appeals to a very specific type of listener. None of y'all asked my opinion. It's literally impossible because this is an asynchronous class, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. I would suggest digesting media the same way you digest food. If you eat nothing but fruits, if you eat nothing but meats, if you eat nothing but vegetables, that's not a healthy diet. And so you need a bit of a balance with everything. All right, so media affects public policy and especially public opinion by forming major group of people's opinions on stuff. Interest groups do the same thing through a different way, though, and that's more formalized and they're more explicit in what they believe. A lot of interest groups are also NGOs or non-governmental organizations. Sorry, national governmental, yeah, non-governmental organizations. Three examples that came to the top of my head are Human Rights Watch and their founder or longtime leader Kenneth Roth, Amnesty International and Agne Calamard, and then APAC with Jonathan Greenblatt. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International both focus on reducing war crime, human rights abuses, obviously. And then APAC is an American group that pushes for greater cooperation with Israel. Of course, there's the whole controversy around them, but we don't have time to get into it. And there's policy elites, which is what you are all going to be by the end of this course because you'll have such a great teacher. But these are highly educated people who put out reports that other groups can cite and stuff like that to push a certain policy one way or another. Council on Foreign Relations is probably the most famous, and I'd say they're pretty buttoned down and professional. Normally I like to take jabs at different groups, but I actually quite like CFR. And then, of course, there's the group that does more, I think, policy direction and overall good than any other group of people in the world. And that is, of course, Hollywood celebrities. I'm joking, by the way. And I know everyone basically has the same take with this. Most actors and actresses are literally paid to be other people. Who cares what they have to say about anything? But everyone's got that one celebrity that they are going to listen to and is going to influence them, whether or not you'll admit it. I know if RZA from Wu-Tang Clan were to start advocating for something, I would at least listen to what he has to say. Now, I know we're all following the Cardi B and Nicki Minaj feud very, very closely, but for those who don't know, they have been beefing since, as you can see here, mid 2017. The fact that this has a Wikipedia page is hilarious, by the way. But we all know that they've been beefing for a very long time, or if you don't, you do now. And let's just say that this beef between these two talented rappers have gone in a very strange direction over time. But sometimes celebrities do, instead of getting involved in a president directly, because we all see the presidential endorsements every election, um, but they'll advocate for specific policies. So Mark Ruffalo wearing a pin for Renee Good, resisting the escalation of ICE patrolling cities. George Clooney is probably the most qualified of any celebrity, not necessarily because of who he is, but he's literally married to a human rights lawyer. They were really involved in this nonprofit where satellite imagery would be used to document mass killings and stuff like that to have people held to justice. Of course, Ben Stiller and I believe Sean Penn went to visit Zelensky, um, which sort of falls in that camp. It's like I don't know how many minds it actually changed. And a weird mix of celebrity endorsement and interest groups has Charlton Heston being, I believe, 5 times the president of the National Rifle Association or the NRA. Yeah, Charlton Heston. I'm sure most of you are like, who the hell is that? He's the guy from Planet of the Apes, or Omega Man, the movie that was eventually redone as I Am Legend with Will Smith. And then Leonardo DiCaprio has been fighting climate change for a long time. Um, Still refuses to not fly a private jet, but what can you do? Hopefully, you can see the pattern in this is sort of like a pyramid scheme or a diffusion of responsibility. At the very top, you have the president, and then party elites, then interest groups and celebrities. And near the bottom, if not at the bottom, we have social media. No, I think when people think about social media's influence on politics, they think about the exemptions or when people trying to do good for their own side end up probably doing more harm than good. But I would say that that's the exception more than the rule because it's so low down on that pyramid example. It's harder to control and more democratized. So while sometimes social media companies, especially a few years ago, would try to, well, they still probably do, it's just less obvious, would really try to direct conversations. It's not always the case. So 2011 Arab Spring kicked off a bunch of pro-democracy protests in mostly Arab majority countries. None of them really stuck, but it was at least a push forward for all the pro-democracy people. So we alluded to this earlier. The Operation, not Epstein, Epic Fury, Operation Epstein, Epic Fury, bombing of Iran. So it was widely seen as unpopular from the get-go. And I don't want to say anything's impossible. The popularity might go up, but it's probably going to be less popular if American troops hit the ground with that, or if the bombing continues. Um, so, what does the popularity matter if the president's just going to do whatever he wants? Well, more than you might think. And of course, there's the whole democracy argument of you vote him out at midterms or take away a lot of power at midterms, which are not that far away. And the other argument is like, well, the counter argument to that would be it's Trump's last term. He can't run anyway, so that he can just do whatever he wants. That's not the case. It wasn't the case with Obama either during his second term. Their public opinion does offer one sort of guardrail for what the president can do. And that's called the two-level game. Sometimes politicians can use public opinion to make deals, which is think like, you want me to do X? I would love to, but I can't sell this at home. It would ruin my career. Um, let's find some other sort of deal that's more favorable for the people at home. Um, and sometimes it's just a negotiation tactic. If you're married, you probably have used this at some point where just to get a pushy salesman to go away, just be like, oh, I would love to buy that Dodge Challenger, but my wife, and then hopefully my wife does the same with me and feel less guilty about it. Anyway, um, public opinion does sort of cap the range of possibilities the president can do even then. Because even if the president wants to maintain power or doesn't care about maintaining power, Congress still does, and Congress has a significant limitation on the president. And this doesn't just apply to democracies, but authoritarian states too. So, like when Mao met Kissinger, they basically everything that their meetings came out with were determined by public opinion within China and the United States. How much they're going to cooperate. With the United States, it's are we going to work with communists? Well, we are if it's going to fight the Soviet Union, because China and the Soviet Union don't like each other. And so threading that needle was almost entirely determined by public opinion. Same with Mao and how much he was going to cooperate with the United States. So there's the whole public opinion. We have causal sensitivity, or what is the context, and what is the competence for the government doing it. The invasion of Iraq would be a lot more popular than a hypothetical invasion of Iran because we're already sort of hung over from the Iraq invasion, for lack of a better term. Rally around the flag, external forces. It can be anything from the Pearl Harbor bombings or 9/11 all the way to jokes about Canada being the first state. But rally around the flag does affect public opinion. And there's elite cues, which we taught to death. Just think about the more dispersed, the more democratized, and the two-level game or selling. And one of the biggest limitations for what a president can do is what his people are willing to tolerate. Not necessarily a president, but also, like in Mao's case, a general secretary or authoritarian leader. All right. Not only are we only doing one module this week, but it's a shorter one at that. You can use all this extra time to do extra well on your midterms. If you have any questions or comments, shoot me an email at this address. And that involves any like change in modality or anything you don't like that I'm doing with the course. I don't know what I don't know. So if something's not working for you, let me know and I can see what I can do to change things up. With that, I will call it not only a day, but a week. Once again, best of luck on your midterms. All right, see ya.